Well, welcome and good evening. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to see everybody here, and those folks online, glad you could join us. Before we get immersed in tonight's program, I'd like to take a moment for some important recognitions for those both in person and at home. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors in the audience? If not, let's give a round of applause for those who might be at home, though. And then a somewhat younger group, veterans or active duty military members of our armed forces of any era. Would you please stand or wave and be recognized? Thanks for your service. And then let me give my own permutation. You know, family members of veterans or active duty, you know, it's only possible with the support of the family. So let's recognize their contribution as well. Hey, thank you. You know, thanks for all that service, and you know, it absolutely makes a difference. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize some of the sponsors and supporters that really make programs such as this happen, both in person and at home. So our Patriot Circle or charter members, any of you here tonight, let's recognize you as well. There you go. So tonight's program is the latest installment of our General Raymond D. Mason Jr. Distinguished Lecture Series. The Mason Lecture Series is devoted to the legacy of America's largest war. Past speakers have included writers, scholars, distinguished members of our armed forces, and journalists. The lecture series is open to the public through the generosity of the late Major General and Mrs. Raymond D. Mason, Jr. and the Raymond D. Mason Foundation. Mason served in the European Theater of Operations during the Second World War in the 4th Armored Division. Part of Patton's Third Army, actually was in the 3rd Army. And you know, prior to his retirement from the U.S. military in 1976, he had held several high-ranking Pentagon positions, including Assistant Deputy Chief of Operations and a Special Assistant to the Deputy Chief of Logistics. So tonight's Mason Lecture continues the museum's Black History Month programming. Tonight's presentation features Dr. Thomas Guglielmo on his award-winning book, Divisions, A New History of Racism and Resistance in America's World War II Military. Dr. Guglielmo is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of American Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's the author of White on Arrival, Italians, Race, Color, and Power in Chicago, 1890 to 1940, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award of the Organization of American Historians. Now, interviewing Dr. Guglielmo tonight will be one of our own fellows, Dr. Marcus Cox. Marcus, many of you knew from town here, but he's currently the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Fayetteville State University, in beautiful Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he's a fellow here at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Now, Marcus specializes in African-American civil military history, modern civil rights movement, African-American history, and U.S. history post-1945. So he's an ideal discussant with Tom for tonight's program. In addition to numerous articles, reviews, and book chapters, he's also the author of Segregated Soldiers, Military Training at Historically Black Colleges in the Jim Crow South. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round welcome for Marcus Cox and Thomas Guglielmo.
All right, do I start, Jeremy? Yep, okay. All right, I think, thank you everyone for being here. This is really exciting. Divisions is a really, I believe, a different history of World War II. And of course, I read quite a few books all the time on World War II and the Black experience, but this book was very, very unique for me. You know, I want to start off by just saying that as I was reading the book, I was thinking a couple of things. Knowing the fact that in 1939, the U.S. Army was composed of approximately a little bit less than 200,000 soldiers. By 1941, or let's go all the way up to 1945, there was over 12 million soldiers in a little more than 5 years. It's a phenomenal accomplishment to raise an army that quickly in a democratic nation. But I think what really sets this study apart from others is it really talks about how that was accomplished in a deeply divided nation, a nation that's divided by race, and the racial politics that were I guess difficult to navigate on the level of the White House, Congress. You have social organizations, you have political organizations. There is politics on a national level, there's politics on a local level. And so I think divisions sort of highlights all of these things. How did this occur? How do you raise an army in a deeply divided nation and figure out a way to be successful? In your opinion, Tom, what should individuals sort of just initially get out of your book in terms of its importance?
You can definitely hear me. I was going to ask if you could hear me. That sounded incredibly loud. I apologize. Before I start, let me just, can people hear me okay when I have it down here? First of all, just thank you, everyone, for coming out. I want to thank Dr. Marcus Cox for joining me here on stage. I want to thank the museum for inviting me down here. And again, I want to thank everybody for coming out. This book is, 390 pages or something. There's a lot in it. I hope if the topic interests you, I hope you'll get a copy and read it, because I'll just, I'll only be able to kind of scratch the surface, I think, in my remarks. But basically, as the subtitle suggests, I really try to tell two major stories. One involves racism, and one involves resistance. In terms of, and of course, the focus is the U.S. military during World War II. And so the racism piece is frankly a really disturbing story, right? So the U.S. military was deeply, deeply divided when it came to race. And the military as an institution was responsible for that. Obviously, some of this was coming from the civilian world, but a lot of it was getting actively reproduced by the military. And so just to kind of make that really concrete. So who served, who fought, who died, who gave orders, who was forced to follow them, who had the best jobs, who got the most promotions, who made the most money, who had the highest ranks, who got to relax at the nicest recreation center on post, who got to swim in the nicest pool in Calcutta, who got to drink at the nicest bar in Cherbourg, France, who was discharged on time and with access to GI Bill benefits, who received honorable discharges, who didn't. I could go on, but the point is that in all of these matters and more, racism sometimes, as I say in the book, spoke decisively. That is, it determined in many, many cases who had advantages and who did not have advantages. And to be very specific, so folks who were defined as white by the military had immense power and privilege relative to everybody else, but in particular relative to African Americans. So that's the division story, that's the racism, and I can talk in more detail about that, but anyways, that's the kind of in brief, the argument about the kind of pervasive nature, the corrosive, pervasive nature of racism in the US military during World War II. The more inspiring story is resistance, because all of that deep, profound, expansive, institutionalized discrimination that I referenced in relation to my comments about racism generated massive activism. There were tons of service members and their family members and civilian organizations that, as you can imagine, were deeply disturbed that a military that was supposedly fighting for freedom and democracy was actually not practicing those things in any of their operations, right? And so, so there were just, to me, very inspiring stories. Again, this is principally African-American soldiers who build a civil rights movement that has been long forgotten in many ways. When we think about the civil rights movement, we don't often think about the military. We might think that, military veterans came out of the military and then were kind of foot soldiers in civilian civil rights struggles, but we don't often think about the military as a kind of a place that birthed civil rights activism. That was a site of really important, dynamic, impressive civil rights activism that in the end, they were up against such incredible obstacles. Often opposition in the White House, opposition in Congress, opposition in the courts, opposition among civilian leaders of the Army and the Navy, among many, many officers, but nonetheless, despite all of that kind of entrenched opposition, they were nonetheless able to eke out some pretty impressive victories, making the US military, I said it was deeply divided by all kinds of different racisms, it actually became more egalitarian over time. It was desegregated in little fits and starts, even before the end of World War II. Why? There are lots of reasons, but it would not have happened but for courageous activism on the part of service members primarily, who, let's not forget, were oftentimes risking their lives to fight, not one war, but two. So in a sense, that's kind of the story I try to tell. And then I try in the conclusion of the book to talk a bit about what larger impact this story had on the nation as a whole in the post-war years, which we might get to in a bit.
Yep. And so, and everything you said obviously is very significant to the story of World War II. But there's currently an extensive history on World War II. Could you tell us, why did you decide to write this particular story, and how does it reflect a new history? Because that's in your subtitle. And what did you hope to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I had a chance earlier today to visit the library here at the museum, where they have thousands of volumes on World War II history, and I didn't need to be reminded of this fact, but it is true that there's just an incredible scholarship on World War II, and it's so unbelievably varied. And so it's a really good question. How is this new? There's not just varied scholarship on virtually every aspect of World War II, but there's a lot of really great scholarship on race and racism within the military during World War II. There's also lots of excellent scholarship on African-American soldiers and their experiences, Japanese-American soldiers and their experiences, Chinese-American soldiers, Puerto Rican soldiers, Mexican-American soldiers, Filipino-American soldiers, and so forth. So there's a lot of great work, but there wasn't, as far as I could tell, there was nothing that attempted to kind of tell these stories together. So that was one thing I was trying to do. I wanted to understand how would our understanding of World War II be enriched by placing African-American history in conversation with, say, Japanese-American history? How do those stories become richer and more compelling when those stories are told in tandem? So that's part of what I think what I hope is new, is I'm kind of again, bringing a range of different histories that have often been told separately together. But I'm also, so in that sense, I'm hoping that it's a bit more comprehensive than some other work. But it's also true, I think, that I'm trying to understand the incredibly complex dynamics of racism and resistance against racism at the level, as I mentioned before, at the level of the White House, how courts were involved, how Congress was involved, how high command was involved, how the civilian leadership in the military, how they were involved, how officers were involved, and how ordinary enlisted personnel were involved. I'm trying to understand it from all of those various angles. And so I'm hoping that's something new as well.
Great. Yeah. So the U.S. military was vastly different in 1940 than at the end of the war in 1945. And you just sort of alluded to how I guess foundationally the military changed as the war went on.
Right.
How did the war influence change in military enlistment and the role of African American soldiers, but also other non-black minorities?
Yeah. So I have a couple chapters in the beginning of the book that focus entirely on enlistment, right? So on kind of the extent to which racism hindered people's ability to join the military. And so in a nutshell, that story, yeah, there's some really, I mean, it's a story of change and it's a story of continuity. So for the historians in the crowd, they'll appreciate those two ever-present considerations. But in terms of change, there was dramatic change, right? So in 1940, before the Selective Training and Service Act is passed, so before the draft legislation for World War II is passed, there were, very, very few service members of color in the military. So, African Americans were a fraction of 1% of the Army and the Navy. They were not allowed in the Marine Corps, and they were not allowed in the Army Air Corps. So Japanese Americans were largely excluded from the military as well. Other folks of color were in the military, but in very, very small numbers. By the end of the war, African Americans are 8 or 9% of the Army. They're about, I think, 3% of the Marine Corps, 5% of the Navy. Japanese Americans, the percentage of Japanese Americans in the U.S. population is roughly equal to the percentage of Japanese Americans in the military. They're only in the Army, though. They're not allowed in the Navy throughout the war. So anyway, there's a lot of change, just numerically speaking, and in terms of percentage. So you see a military that's largely white at the beginning of the war, less so by the end of the war. But on this question of enlistment, on this question of, who's able to join, this kind of fundamental question about just who's able to join, there are some continuities too. So, for example, I spend a whole chapter detailing the ways in which the U.S. military, and in particular the Army, and really the War Department, kind of systematically, deliberately, and consistently across all of the war years, restricted African American access to the Army. And they did this in a whole range of ways. Initially, the whole branches were just off limits to them, right? But African American activism, the demand for troops, kind of ended some of those blanket bans on African American enlistment. So that was a change, but the War Department found other ways to restrict African Americans' participation. So the draft, you'd think that the draft, you've got draft numbers and selective service would pick people according to your draft number. That wasn't the case in World War II. It was according to race and your draft number. You had white specific draft calls and you had African American specific draft calls. And through these race-specific draft calls, the Army was able to kind of restrict African American access. They had chronically low draft calls for African Americans. It was very hard for African Americans to volunteer. There are so many stories. I saw some here in the museum, especially early in the war, but across all of the war years, it was very, very difficult for an African American who wanted to join the military, right? Imagine They're in the United States, they're hearing on the radio, they're seeing in the newspaper, they're hearing from people in their neighborhoods how important this war is, how democracy itself is hanging in the balance. Everyone needs to get into this war. It's your patriotic duty. And African Americans are saying, yeah, some are saying, no. This country has never been democratic for me. I'm not fighting for some war that's supposedly about democracy because I don't have that here in this country, right? But there are other people, like the author of the famous letter to the editor that coined the phrase double V. He said, well, I may be a half American now, but I believe that if I serve my country bravely in time of war, then I will be treated as a full-fledged American down the road. And so there are plenty of African Americans who said, you know what, I trust in the United States, I'm gonna serve. They go down to the recruitment office and they're turned away, time and again. They're turned away over and over again. So that was another way in which the Army restricted African American access. A third way was at induction stations. So in thousands of cases, draft boards would say, you know what, you're fit to serve, you're 1A, but then they get to the induction station where the military had broad authority under the Selective Training and Service Act to decide who was suitable to serve, who was acceptable. And, according to draft officials, they were constantly complaining that the military was coming up with one excuse after another to reject African American inductees or draftees. And so anyway, in all of these very complicated ways, it took a lot of time to make sense of this process. But the bottom line was the Army only wanted so many African Americans. It was because of a whole set of very prejudiced views about African Americans' capabilities as service members, but it also had to do with a deep commitment to segregation. And they felt like if there was a kind of an unlimited number of African Americans coming into the military, it'd be more difficult to keep them in segregated units. So for those two reasons, even though African American access to the military improved quite a bit over the course of the war, again, thanks in part to African American persistent activism, courageous activism. It's also true that restrictions remained in place from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. And as I say, just to kind of put a really fine point on this, African Americans were about 10% of the US population during World War II. They were about 7% of military personnel during World War II. The difference between 7% and 10% is about 500,000 service members, right? And again, African Americans were always overrepresented among folks defined as 1A, fit to serve. And so there were many, many more African Americans who could have served in the military, but the military essentially said no. And so I think it's really worth pondering what difference 500,000 additional troops might have made to the US war effort, right? And if those folks could have survived the war, they would have had access to GI Bill, and even though that was obviously complicated in the post-war years. But nonetheless, it's worth really thinking carefully about the implications, the kind of profound implications of this, again, this kind of concerted effort to restrict African American access to the military.
And so as I think about the historic right to fight, African American leaders are early on in the war, they're petitioning the Roosevelt administration, they're sending letters to the US Army saying, African Americans should have this opportunity, and they're seeking allies to help them support in this campaign. But I found it interesting that Southern congressmen and senators were critical of the Army for rejecting African American inductees from serving. And they believed that this policy of rejecting African Americans was really detrimental to the South. Could you kind of elaborate or explain that?
Yeah, this is a real surprise, and many African American newspapers kind of relished the irony of white segregationists decrying discrimination against African Americans when it came to access to the military. So yeah, I mean, African Americans were the principal you know, force in pushing for greater access to the military, this right to fight campaign for sure. It involved would-be service members, it involved black newspapers, it involved black officials within the War Department. There weren't many, but the few that were there, folks like William Hastie, very active in this effort. But yes, there were some surprising members of this. I don't know if coalition is probably too strong a word, but there were a very varied group of people that were actually pushing for African Americans to have greater access to the military, and they had very different motivations. So you had African Americans who you know, wanted to fight because they were patriotic, wanted to fight because the military, you know, had all kinds of resources available to them that were hard to come by in the Jim Crow South or elsewhere in the United States. You know, wanted to fight because, you know, as the March on Washington movement said, we are Americans too, right? There are all kinds of motivations to be involved in this fight. But white segregationists were seeing the restrictions on African Americans' access and understood that an underrepresentation of African Americans in the military meant an overrepresentation of everybody else. This is what the NAACP called the Jim Crow boomerang, right? That this was you know, and so some segregationists kind of, you know, got wise to this fact and started saying, well, hold it, African Americans are being kept out of the military, more white folks are getting pulled into the military. This is gonna mean, the offensive term that they used was the Negroification of America because of military discrimination against African Americans. So there were some Southern white segregationists who pushed for greater access in the military. There were also military officials who were segregationists themselves and who often were not all that progressive on race issues, but nonetheless realized that, well, hold it, if the Navy doesn't take a certain share of African Americans, then the Army will have to take more. And so there were all kinds of not always super principled or you know, democratic motivations for what should have been a kind of a fairly straightforward position that all Americans should have an equal access to serve in the military, all able-bodied people.
So one of the profound impacts of divisions was how fluid definitions of race became during the war. So please discuss who was considered white and why colored Americans such as Puerto Ricans, Hispanic, and Native Americans were never assigned to segregated units.
Yeah, so this is another complicated story, but so when it came to units, you know, when the military was deciding, you know, who's going to serve, I'm trying to figure out how to condense this answer, but the bottom line is there were some, there were non-black segregated units in the military. There weren't many of them, but there were all Puerto Rican units, and when I say all Puerto Rican, I meant in the case of Puerto Ricans, it was pretty much all Puerto Ricans in the unit. There were all Mexican-American units, not many, but there were a few. And when I say all Mexican-American, I mean all enlisted personnel in the unit were Mexican-American. Anglos or whites were the senior officers in these units. There were Chinese-American units. There were a few Native American units. There was even an all-Norwegian unit. There was a Greek unit. Anyway, so there were some ethno-racially specific units, but they were kind of these, they were exceptions, you know, and in all of these cases, these folks had all kinds of options. They were able to join other units. They didn't just have to join that one ethno-racially specific unit. In the case of African Americans, they had no choice. They had to serve in segregated units that had all enlisted personnel as African American, and in almost all cases, all of the senior officer corps were white. So what that meant is that the big question when it came to deciding who was in a segregated unit, it really didn't so much come down to who was white and who was not white. It came down to who was black and who was not black. When it came to segregated units, that was the big question. And I have a whole chapter where I explain how it is that if you have segregated units that are, you have black units over here and you have pretty much everyone else units over here, you have to have some way of deciding who goes where. And you also have to have a way of making these decisions, you know? And so it's not a simple process deciding, you know, what race a person is and where they're gonna go. And there were, in the vast majority of cases, there was no controversy, right? The draft board would say, you're white, you're gonna go in this white unit. But in hundreds of cases, some very contentious, the draft board might say, we think you're African American, you're gonna go in a black unit, and someone would say, well, no, hold it, I'm not black, I'm Native American, or I'm something else. And so anyway, this question about who is black and who is not black was a really, really big, complicated question. And it was also a question about who got to make this decision. You know, was it draft boards? There was nothing in the Draft Act that authorized draft boards to be making these decisions. So anyway, that was the big question in terms of who served where in a segregated US military. But on this question about whiteness, yeah, I mean, the short answer is that it just was really, really complicated, right? So you had Japanese Americans who at times were told explicitly by their senior officers when they're training in Camp Shelby in Mississippi, they're told explicitly, you know, you're gonna go off base. And not just off base, on base, you're gonna see these segregation signs, white and colored, you're white, you're white. There are times later in the war when Japanese Americans are fighting in Italy, the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, fighting heroically alongside white service members, and you know, comradeship is so powerful that boundaries really break down between Japanese Americans and many white service members, and they're kind of, you know, included among these white service members. They're defended, they're celebrated as these kind of true Americans, and in those kinds of moments, they're almost accepted as white. So there's that story, but at the same time, I also explore the ways in which even if they were kind of accepted as white at certain times, in so many other ways, big and small ways, they were constantly reminded, no, you're not, you may serve in a white unit. There were certain Japanese Americans who did serve in white units. You might serve in a white unit, but you're not really fully white, and that might be expressed in the form of a, you know, a slur used, or, you know, no, you can't dance with the white women at this dance, or you can't go to that USO, or when you're off base, regardless of what your commanding officer might tell you, you're not actually really white when you go to that drinking fountain or something. So anyway, the bottom line is I'm using Japanese Americans as a case, but when it came to all non-black minorities, they kind of zigged and zagged in a sense between a kind of a nominal whiteness and honorary whiteness, you know, and a non-whiteness that was, you know, led to all kinds of discrimination.
And so one of the things that really struck me was, and as we're talking about the U.S. military and the federal government building this massive army, and there are these issues in terms of who's white, who's non-white. How do they serve? You know, what are the limitations of their service? Ladies and gentlemen, there's no blueprint. There's no guide to say this is what we do in this situation. Literally, this is all sort of being decided on the fly. And it could be on the federal level, it could be on the local level, it could be the military in terms of the Army. The Army was different than the Navy. And then, of course, you have the Army Air Corps. Mm-hmm. And no one's talking to each other. Everybody's sort of making these decisions in their best interest. So as I was thinking more about, and I think you focus a lot on Japanese Americans, not as much as African Americans, but certainly their experience. I notice, for instance, when the war starts, they're barred from any military service. and they're considered to be unloyal, even though they didn't have anything to do with Pearl Harbor.
Right.
But as the war changes, their status changes. Could you just talk a little bit more about as the war goes on? Now, again, is this a situation where when the war starts, they're considered to be unloyal and there's a fear of an invasion on the West Coast? But then by 1943, when the Americans in the South Pacific are starting to gain ground, you know, are they now looked at differently? So it's the war that's really the influence and not them themselves.
Yeah, so the Japanese-American story, I kind of talked a bit about this just now, but yeah, it's incredibly complex and it's always changing. So just in terms of their access to the military, right, so early on they have, well again, the Navy throughout the war excludes them completely. That just doesn't change. In terms of the Army, after the Draft Act is passed, thousands stream into the Army and they seem to be included without any real restrictions. But then Pearl Harbor happens, and the Army ends up excluding all future Japanese-American inductees. And that lasts for about 9 months or so. And then in the start of 1943, it's announced that, well, actually, we're going to change the Army is going to change its view on this, and they're going to actually start including Japanese-American voluntary enlistees. A year later, they include Japanese-American draftees. They restart. They reinstitute selective service for Japanese Americans, and there are folks who are in camps who are getting drafted into the U.S. military. All kinds of, that, as you can imagine, caused all kinds of protest in these camps. People, you know, again, lots of, you know, different responses, as you saw with African Americans. Some Japanese Americans said, this is my opportunity to prove that we're loyal. Other people said, hold it. I've been in a camp for the last 2 years. I'm a U.S. citizen, but I'm not being treated like a U.S. citizen. My whole family has been uprooted from their home. They could only bring a couple, you know, what they could carry to this barren landscape somewhere in, you know, some desert out west. You know, I'm not serving the military until I am promised certain things like citizenship rights. You know, I will fulfill my citizenship obligations when I am treated like a citizen, right? So there are a very wide range of views within the Japanese American community about whether to serve. In any case, the bottom line is their access to the military changes radically. And then, as I mentioned earlier, by the end of the war, there are about, I don't know, 24,000 or so Japanese Americans who served during World War II. You'll see 33,000 here in the museum. I think that includes some folks who joined up after the end of the war in Europe and in Asia. In any case, lots of change for Japanese Americans. Lots of change in terms of the kinds of units they were able to join. So initially, early in the war, they're only serving in so-called white units. They're integrated in white units. And then towards the middle, after they're excluded from the military, there's kind of a move towards segregating Japanese Americans, and you have the creation of the 100th Infantry Battalion. You have the creation of the 442nd. You have the creation of a few other all Japanese American units. And that becomes the kind of sole place for many Japanese Americans. But then by the end of the war, there's a move away from segregation. So when it comes to their access to the military, when it comes to their segregation in the military, it's constantly shifting. It's shifting, to answer your question, in part because of Japanese American activism. It's shifting in part because of the U.S. military's, you know, growing, there's a lot of debate within the War Department about these things, but some pretty prominent officials within the War Department become pretty convinced that Japanese Americans could really be a big military asset, and so it's in the interests of the U.S. military to start, you know, allowing them to enlist and then to draft them. But there are also considerations regarding the kind of international scene, right? So this is a time, remember, during World War II when Axis propaganda is constantly calling the United States out for hypocrisy, saying, you know, you say that this is a war for the four freedoms, but how come Japanese Americans are in camps? How come African Americans are treated like second-class citizens? Japanese Japan and other Axis powers are broadcasting this all around the world. And so there are folks in the War Department who are too committed to anti-black racism to kind of do much about that. But when it comes to Japanese Americans, they think, well, if we can be a little bit kinder and gentler with Japanese Americans, if we can offer them more rights, if we can treat them more like US citizens, this could help us in kind of combating some of this Axis propaganda. So the bottom line is lots of changes, and I just mentioned enlistment and assignment to units, whether integrated or segregated, but there's even more change in terms of the Japanese American troops' lived experience. But the bottom line is there's just lots of change during the war, and it involves all kinds of different factors.
And so, I guess when myself speaking definitely, but I guess a lot of individuals, when they think of military integration, they think, generally that military segregation is based on race. To serve in the military alongside of other Americans, there is an implication of equality. You're living together, you're sleeping together, you're working together, you're eating together, all of those things. So for me, I always assumed that the military pushed back on integration primarily because they did not want to go down that road in terms of giving African Americans the idea that they were equal to whites. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I noticed in your book that it kind of surprised me a little bit. You say the military believed without carefully controlling black people's induction numbers, it would be forced to do the unthinkable, integrate. Right. And so that never crossed my mind. Could you kind of explain that a little bit more?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think so for so many military leaders, integration was utterly unthinkable during World War II. I mean, it's kind of amazing in retrospect. One of the beauties of history is being able to go back and to see, we kind of know how things turn out, right? But when you go back in time, you can kind of see how things that seemed impossible at one moment actually became possible. So, just 4 or 5 years before Truman's executive order that starts the integration process, well, some integration happened before then, but the bottom line is, yes, I mean, the military leaders kind of across the board, the Navy, a little more complicated, they kind of started becoming more comfortable with the possibility of some integration, but for the Army, utterly unthinkable for virtually the entire war. And so that's, as I said earlier, that's one of the principal reasons why African Americans' access to the military was so often restricted, because these leaders thought that, again, if it was unrestricted, it would make segregation more complicated to maintain. But yeah, I mean, this was, interestingly, for African Americans, segregation, one thing that was kind of striking to me was this was not a big civil rights issue in the 30s. The military had been segregated for quite some time. African Americans, the fight was really about greater access to the military, more access to the officer ranks, and those sorts of things. There wasn't much of a call for integration, but as the war, one of the things I try to chart is the kind of rise of this movement to integrate the military. And that is something that, again, kind of starts slowly, but in very early on in America's participation in the war, you start seeing growing numbers of African Americans realize that it's not that they didn't realize there was a problem with segregation. I think many of them were being practical, and they thought that there was no way that it made more sense to kind of fight for, again, greater inclusion rather than integration, because integration was just never going to happen. That's what some people thought. But growing numbers of African Americans said, you know what, let's forget what's practical and what's not practical. It's absolutely outrageous that a country that says it's fighting for democracy and freedom is segregating its soldiers on the basis of race. And growing numbers of African Americans are coming to accept this as a article of faith, and to not just do that, but to really fight for it. Growing numbers of people are organizing to integrate the military. And I believe that this is kind of a chapter in the desegregation story that hasn't often been told, that I believe you cannot understand the eventual integration of the military without this kind of early activism, primarily from African Americans, although Japanese Americans also were pushing for their own integration. And these kind of early battles, I think, set the stage, really kind of laid the foundation for the post-war integration of the military. But, you know, yes, it had to do with the Cold War. Yes, it had to do with Truman's leadership. Yes, it had to do with party politics. There were lots of factors, but one essential factor was kind of the grassroots struggles for integration that emerged during the war.
And I'm glad you sort of mentioned that, because that was sort of my next question as we look at 1948 and the integration of the military. And one of the things I used to always tell my students, you know, at least, you know, don't necessarily believe that it happened because it was the moral and ethical thing to do, and it was the right thing to do because it's always been the right thing to do, and it never happened. Right. And so when you look at the Cold War, certainly as a major influence, you have U.S. businessmen who are going around the world in the late 1940s, early 50s. And they're establishing business ties with Africa, South America, colored nations, but at the same time, you have lynchings going on in the South. You have Isaac Woodward, who's blinded, wearing his military uniform. Well, guess what these foreign countries and these leaders want to talk about? They don't want to talk about business. They want to ask questions about African-American lynchings. And so this becomes very, very difficult conversation for them. And literally, these individuals will run to the nearest phone and call the White House or call senators and say, look, you guys have to do something about this. Attacks on African Americans wearing their uniforms, segregation, all of these things make it very difficult for us to establish ties to these colored nations that are also being courted by the Russians. Can you sort of talk about a little bit about that? But also, by the end of the war, you see this loosening of segregation. Obviously, you have a few units that fight in the Battle of the Bulge that have African Americans in those units, and they perform admirably. You have the sort of this narrative about fighting for freedom. And fighting against dictators who embrace racist, philosophies. But certainly between 1945 and 1948, there are a few things that are happening that the military feels that maybe this isn't our best interest. Yeah. Yep. So could you sort of elaborate on that? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really get into those post-war years in this book. But yeah, I mean, I think essentially, I say that for many War Department leaders, integration is unthinkable for most of the war. But that does start to change by the end of the war among officers and among civilian leadership in the War Department. Part of that has to do with certain experiments that are that happened towards the end of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. There are about, I think, 50 African-American platoons that are integrated with companies in fighting in Western Europe, and yes, they fight African-Americans. Many of them kind of are demoted in order to, these are sergeants and corporals and things, and they're demoted to join this fighting unit, this integrated fighting unit, and they serve very admirably. The Army starts to study this. They're like, okay, well, we've said this is not possible. And by the way, they didn't think it was possible in part because they often blamed enlisted personnel. They often said, oh, well, the enlisted personnel will never go for this. They'd be overcome with essentially, I mean, the argument was that white enlisted personnel were so racist that they would never be able to serve in the same unit with African Americans. That was what military leaders were saying. They were assuming that this was the case. But actually, when this experimentation happened, what many officers found in the field was that, in fact, comradeship transcended color lines. You know, when these folks, you know, as I say, the color line, there are no color lines in foxholes. That's a line that you hear over and over again by the end of the war from many African Americans, you know, and that is kind of what happens in this particular case. And the very few instances when African Americans are given a chance to fight alongside white folks, this kind of stuff happens. So, you know, the tragedy is that it was not more widespread, right? But where it happened, you know, color lines broke down, racism broke down. These things are not immutable, right? And white folks turned out to be a lot more flexible than their leaders thought they were. And there were, as I said, there were studies about this. They did extensive surveys and extensive, you know, quantitative and qualitative social science surveys of these units to understand, okay, so how did white folks think about this? Was it really true that these boundaries broke down? And they found time and time again that that was in fact completely true, even when many white folks didn't expect that to happen. It did happen. But this experiment, you know, was so at odds with the kind of conventional wisdom of War Department leaders that they buried the survey results for years. You know, they didn't want anyone to see this because it so undermined the logic that they were operating, the kind of logic that they were following for so long.
So as we ramp up, I have one more question for you that, and of course, I think as we talk about, you know, World War II as the good war, and also that generation as the greatest generation, what does divisions tell us about the good war and the greatest generation?
Well, I think it's complicated. You know, is the simple story. You know, I mean, you know, I guess it's not entirely a celebratory story. Obviously, when you take racism seriously, this is not America's you know, proudest moment in certain respects. In other respects, it absolutely is. But when you center racism, it's, you know, a travesty. It's an absolute travesty when you're fighting a war that's for democracy, for equality, for freedom, and your military is this, what I call a kind of sprawling structure of white supremacy. And it was that. That sounds kind of, you know, unnecessarily harsh, but I think anybody who understands the details of how the military operated would absolutely have to come to that conclusion. So it's just an immense tragedy. But, you know, and so, yes, I mean, there's been lots of work complicating this greatest generation idea, lots of work complicating the good war idea. I would kind of add myself to that broader conversation. But you know, I think this story has contemporary relevance maybe in other ways too, right? So I'm not a scholar of the contemporary military, but I do know that some of the, and of course the military has changed dramatically, right? So it is in many respects a more integrated institution than many others in our country, and it's often held up in that way. And that's, I think there's a lot of truth to that from, you know, my understanding, reading kind of some reports and studies, but nonetheless, I think there's still barriers to promotion based on race from my understanding. High command is still kind of largely disproportionately white. I know AP did a report where there's still quite a bit of racism in the ranks. So there are still problems in the military that maybe this history can help us to understand some of the roots of some of those problems. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Marcus and Tom. We have time for a few short questions. Please raise your hand. We'll start in the front row.
All right. So you've talked a lot about the Army and the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force, but this is also a period where women are integrated for the first time. So how does gender complicate this racism for the women of color who are doubly discriminated against at times?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, truthfully, I don't do that. This book doesn't tackle that question as, I mentioned my book being kind of comprehensive in certain respects. It's not comprehensive in that respect. And I know Laura's here. There are some scholars who are doing this work now, and I'm really excited about that. But I can say a few things. So, yeah, I mean, so African American, we talked about access. Well, African American women had an even more difficult time gaining access. They never gained access to the, the waves until very late in the war. They were included in the WACs, but faced a lot of the same sorts of discrimination that male service members did. So women, Japanese American women, were included much later. Again, a similar kind of story. They had, if Japanese Americans had limited access at a time, Japanese American women had even more limited access. Again, the same as African Americans. So there's definitely that, the ways in which, as you say, kind of the intersections of racism and sexism kind of created even higher boundaries for enlistment. But there are some complications too. So, when Japanese American women are included late in the war in the U.S. Army, in the WACs, they are actually integrated at a time when Japanese American men tend not to be, right? So it's not always predictable, but right, when you throw in this kind of added variable of gender and this added kind of perspective on sexism, the story, which is complicated enough, gets that much more complicated. And I haven't mentioned gender, but that's a whole nother part of the story, which again, I honestly don't do it justice, but it's definitely part of the story. So, manliness and masculinity are so attached to soldiering, and manliness and manhood are so connected to civil rights struggles, for decades and decades. Manhood rights are often seen as synonymous with equal rights, and so that's very much connected to struggles for equal rights within the military. It's in part about how men should be treated, not just people, but men in particular, right? But at the same time, I'm reminded of this great article in the Pittsburgh Courier, which was one of the great black newspapers during World War II, and it had this great line about how, the Pittsburgh Courier was one of the most kind of vocal proponents of greater democracy in the military. In time, one of the most vocal proponents for desegregation and more equal treatment for African American service members. And they had some line later in the war where they were crediting African American activism with actually some of the military reforms that were happening late in the war. And they were talking about how it was a consequence of the manliness of male and female service members. So somehow manliness was surprisingly kind of more expansive than I would have guessed, so women could be manly too, and in that way they also were kind of pushing for equal rights. And by the way, I'll say that one final thing is that women were, I mentioned this kind of, concerted effort on the part of African Americans and other service members of color to gain equal rights within the military, and just how consequential this struggle was. African American women were very much part of this struggle. They were a small minority of African American troops. I think it was 2, 3, 4% or something by the end of the war. But nonetheless, they were overrepresented. When I talk about activism, I've never given specifics, but there were boycotts, there were sit-ins, there were, there was heroic soldiering, there was letter writing, there was, all kinds of, there was there was armed resistance at times. So it was very varied activism, and African American women were very much a part of that. So just to give you a sense, but more work needs to be done, and I don't do it justice, honestly.
Next question to your left.
I have not read the book, but I had a question. You mentioned that the leadership in the Army was concerned that the lower enlisted would be racist against African Americans being in the equal ranks and sharing equal birthing areas and such. My question is, was there ever any concern for safety that with the Japanese segregation and maybe the Navy's efforts to exclude Japanese from being on a vessel in tight quarters with white soldiers, with other soldiers or American soldiers, that maybe the safety of the Japanese soldiers was a concern, or were they going to be in any kind of danger with these lower enlisted if they were in those situations? So I have not read the book, but if that's in there, or if you covered that, or if any of your research showed that that was a concern.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I do mention it a bit. Yeah, so it was Japanese American troops were in the fight, fought in the Pacific as interpreters and translators, but they weren't there as combat troops. There were a few exceptions, but for the most part, they were there as I said, interpreters and translators, linguists. And that was in part for this very concern that you bring up. They often said, oh, our troops won't be able to tell the difference between Japanese troops and Japanese American troops. And in fact, that did happen. I do mention in the book that there were all kinds of moments when, Japanese American troops were actually in danger because of some of these kind of misunderstandings and things. So that was part of the story for sure. And in fact, that was one of the arguments they made for continuing the segregation of Japanese American troops. They said, they can't really fight in the Pacific other than as linguists and things. And so it made it easier in their mind to it made it easier from a kind of a logistical standpoint to keep them in particular theaters if they were all in particular units. So that also kind of stemmed in part, and I'm not saying this was the sole justification, but this was, or the sole reason why Japanese Americans were segregated, but this is one thing that they cited as a concern. So yeah, that's a good inference.
Tom, I've got a question that is shared by the audience. The book cover. Can you talk about the art and the artist? I know it's often decided by the publisher, but can you explain the history behind?
Yes. So this was a painting by Charles White, who became a fairly well-known African American painter who was a soldier himself. This was painted during World War II, so while he was a soldier. He would go on to become, as I say, a fairly famous painter. I think he had a solo show in the Metropolitan Museum, not the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but the MoMA, what does MoMA stand for? Modern Art. Anyway, I didn't know much about him. I was at a small conference in Paris, France, of all places, 4 or 5 years ago, and on the program for this conference was this incredible image. And I had never seen it before, and I'd been researching this book for over 10 years at this point and felt like I'd come across most of the well-known images of African American service members, and this one was just really arresting. And so I kind of tracked it down, and a whole nother story to tell you how I was able to finally get the rights to put it on the cover. It was a little complicated. Charles White passed some years ago, and in any case, that was complicated. But to me, what's so powerful about it is it captures some of the kind of visceral consequences of divisions, right? It's easy to kind of talk about things like racism and color lines and to think it's all quite abstract, that this isn't really involving real people and having any real human effects or something. But this really, I think, powerfully shows just at least my reading, obviously we can kind of interpret it in different ways, but my reading is that, this is a soldier who's weighed down, kind of visibly weighed down by what is unclear, of course, but if you know the history, it's not surprising that he would kind of look this way. But it's also just, I think, a beautiful painting.
Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Tom Guglielmo and Marcus Cox.
Well, thank you, Tom and Marcus. Tom will be signing copies of his book, Divisions, at the table in front of the Higgins boat there. So those who haven't read it yet, here's your chance to certainly get your own. And I think you'll find it's an incredible read. A couple announcements. Please mark your calendars for March 8th. We'll host our next Meet the Author event featuring a good friend, Lynn Olson. We'll be presenting here on her newest book, Empress of the Nile, the daredevil archaeologist who saves Egypt's ancient temples from destruction. And then also in March, on the 29th of March, CNN's entertainment reporter Chloe Millis will be here with us to discuss her grandfather's book, Luck of the Draw, My Story of the Air War in Europe, written by her late grandfather and a veteran of the 100th Bomb Group, Frank Murphy. So great opportunity here. Chloe and her mother have republished Frank's epic story, and it will be featured in the upcoming series, Masters of the Air. So those that get to watch TV, which none of you emerging scholars do, that's something that's going to be the rest of America get a chance to see. So, everyone's welcome, and for those at home, come join us in person. But I'd like to thank everyone who joined us here tonight. Thanks for coming out. I know I sure learned a lot from this, and I'm looking forward to learning more. Please join me in one more final round of applause for Dr. Thomas Guglielmo for being with us tonight. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.